Jim Fetzer, welcome to Nature of Reality Radio again. You've gone on my show in the past when I was on Blog Talk back in the day, and we talked about a lot of things. And I feel like such an ignoramus not hearing about your unfortunate experience dealing with the courts and all, and what they've done to you with that phony lawsuit. And I think I should emphasize phony because, well, there seems to be a lot of suspicious things about it. And well, I've said enough. You've got the floor. Why don't you tell us anything and everything? For those that don't know about this, I'm sure there are some that are ignorant about this. So for those people, enlighten them on what happened to you, and then all the rest of it, and then what you plan to do from there, and then how they can donate to you and all that. Make sure you get that in there as well. So you got the floor. I'll shut up and put myself on mute. Tell us everything.
No. That's fine. That's fine, Andrew. Well, it turns out that there's a practice by the fellow who has become the face of Sandy Hook, who calls himself Leonard Pozner, who claims to be the father of a Sandy Hook child by the name of Noah, who has launched lawsuits, I think, around a half a dozen, including against Wolfgang Halbig. He pioneered a case against James Tracy. Just to give a little background about the two of them, Wolfgang is a former Florida state trooper and U.S. customs agent, a former school principal, and a nationally recognized school safety expert. Wolfgang got into research about Sandy Hook because he wanted to learn what happened in order to advise other school systems how to make sure it didn't happen to them. I mean, what could be a more pure motive? How could anyone have better credentials? So he began submitting FOIA requests and making phone calls, and noticed that his FOIA requests were going unanswered. His phone calls weren't being returned, and before he knew it, there were two homicide detectives from a local precinct on his porch in the gated community where he resides in Florida, telling him they were there on behalf of the Florida State Police to warn him that if he didn't stop asking questions about Sandy Hook, he would be prosecuted. More about Wolfgang to come. James Tracy was an associate professor, a tenured professor of communications at Florida Atlantic University. He even had courses on media and conspiracy, who began his first blog related to Sandy Hook on the press conference by the medical examiner, Wayne Carver, which was very odd in many different respects. He claimed to have just done the autopsies, but he didn't know how many boys or how many girls. He didn't know how many times each of them had been shot. At one point, he makes the very bizarre remark that he hopes this doesn't come crashing down on the people of Newtown, all of which is peculiar indeed if it were a bona fide legitimate event, where Tracy wrote what I regard or one of the first academic or scholarly articles about Newtown on his blog, about the very press conference, how it raised more questions than it answered. And where at one point he was using, I guess, an image of of Lenny Pozner as he appears in the international press with a little boy who's supposed to be Noah Pozner, and I'll have more to say about this immediately, and wrote to Pozner to ask. When Pozner raised a copyright objection to Tracy using the images, he wrote to him to ask if he had a bona fide copyright claim to the photographs, because it turns out it's fairly specific. The copyright belongs to the photographer, for example, and fair use and criticism and so forth are exceptions to copyright rules. Well, Pozner turned that into a form of harassment. I mean, it was just Tracy asking a perfectly legitimate question and began assailing him with op-eds in the Florida papers. The Jewish Journal Forward had carried an onslaught against Tracy. The Florida Sun Sentinel wrote about him, and it was all extremely negative, when in fact, what Tracy was doing, parallel to Wolfgang, was seeking to protect the public from a con, because his research was suggesting that Sandy Hook had been an orchestrated event, not a real shooting, and that the public was being scammed out of millions of dollars on the basis of a false portrayal, which is a form of fraud. It's called theft by deception. And indeed, my research has suggested that the sympathetic but gullible Americans contributed between 27 and $130 million to the survivors, allegedly 20 children and 6 adults. And if you divide that evenly among them, that's between $1 and $5 million for feigning to have a child who died at Sandy Hook, or a relative who was a teacher or an administrator. And so if Tracy's right, and there's every good reason to believe that he is, then this is a scam of enormous proportions. Nevertheless, this onslaught against Tracy, where the Jewish community in South Florida is very influential, where Pozner happens to be Jewish, put tremendous pressure on Florida Atlantic University, and they came up with an excuse to fire him, which was highly contrived, namely that he hadn't signed a form about his outside activities, because the blogs were something he was doing in his own time. I mean, it wasn't a university activity. It was simply something he was doing on his own time. It was obviously a First Amendment right to exercise his opinions. Nevertheless, on highly artificial grounds, Tracy, I was dumbfounded, was actually removed from his tenured position at Florida Atlantic. This is, in my opinion, a great disgrace to higher education. But I've documented that in relation to Tracy's case, for example, that such august news media as the New York Times and the Washington Post were publishing propaganda pieces about Sandy Hook. They were publishing stuff they knew to be false, and in blogs I published about them, I demonstrated how they knew them to be false, and where even the Chronicle of Higher Education, a publication, for college and university professors and associates, instructors, etc., had a similar propaganda piece against him. I also published about that. So it was pretty disconcerting when Tracy was taken out. In fact, he invited me to be the head of his legal defense fund, which I was very pleased to do, until eventually Pozner got around to me at the beginning of, at the end of 2019. Actually, I think the case was filed on 27 November 2018. I was served on the 29th of November 2018. And the process server said she'd never seen anyone so happy to receive a lawsuit. Well, I felt this was an opportunity to present the massive research that I'd done about Sandy Hook, including the publication of a book entitled Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, where it was co-edited with Mike Palachuk, who was a series editor who suggested the title and the preface, wrote the preface, whereas I brought together all the experts, organized the book, and, did the layout and all that, secured the assistance with the designing the cover and so forth. Well, I brought together 13 experts, including 6 current or retired PhD professors, where we established that the school had been closed by 2008, that there were no students there, and that it was a FEMA drill presented as mass murder to promote gun control. Indeed, one of our other contributors, Paul Preston, who has a radio show of his own, which is rather well known, called Agenda 21, and who is himself a school administrator who supervised active shooter drills, was so disturbed by what he saw being broadcast from Newtown that day that he reached out to his contacts in the Obama Department of Education, all of whom confirmed to him that it had been a drill, that no one had died, and that it was done to promote gun control. Indeed, James Tracy even discovered the FEMA manual for the 4-day exercise with the rehearsal on the 13th of December and the going live on the 14th of 2012. So I included that as Appendix A in the manual. It was, technically speaking, a mass casualty exercise involving children. We have a tremendous amount of evidence from what was being broadcast Newtown that day and other sources that indeed it was a drill that was taking place on the ground in accordance with a manual. For example, there was a sign, a portable sign, that said, everyone must check in, which is consistent with a manual which states everyone must check in with a controller upon arrival because the participants were going to be paid for their involvement in this exercise. We found porta potties were already in place and that pizza and bottled water was available at the firehouse, which was like a staging area, which is, again, consistent with a FEMA exercise because they provide routinely refreshments and restrooms. We also had footage of a vast number of persons who were wearing name tags on lanyards. Very odd if this had been a mass murder and people were just showing up spontaneously. But it's characteristic of FEMA drills that they identify the participants by means of color-coded name tags on lanyards. We also had photographs of parents bringing children to the scene, but no parent is going to bring a child to the scene of a child shooting massacre. It's simply an absurdity. On the other hand, because it was the rehearsal, they were treating it as a festive occasion and having a good time. Now, some of the participants became confused and put up websites prior to the event. They were supposed to be donating to the survivor families on the 14th. They were all putting them up on the 13th. In fact, Wolfgang has established that even the United Way had a donation website. I think one or another of these was put up as early as the 11th. You had some on the 11th, on the 12th, on the 13th. So, obviously you can't have a bona fide shooting on the 14th of December when you have donation websites going up on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th in advance. Not the only glitch, because even Adam Lanza, the purported shooter, was initially recorded in the Social Security Death Index as having died on the 13th. Clear evidence, people here were confused about the 13th as the rehearsal and the 14th as going live. In any case, we had this mass footage that was broadcast that day from taken on different occasions. They even had showing a SWAT team charging into a school, but it wasn't Sandy Hook Elementary. It was St. Rose of Lima, which is also in the vicinity. Before I edited the book, had done a lot of research on Sandy Hook. I had already published 30 articles about it. And I was outdone by quite a large margin, however, by another of my contributors, Dr. Eowyn, of the Mind's blog, which I highly recommend, who had already published 80 articles about Sandy Hook. So when I edited the book, I was able to take, the best of the best, some of the chapters were specifically commissioned, but most of them I had previously published on my blog and then organized and edited, or they'd been on Dr. Ewan's blog, or they'd been on James Tracy's blog, or whatever. But then I created a book of about 450 pages, which was published by Amazon on the 22nd of October, 2015. Now, people had a great eagerness to find out what really happened at Sandy Hook, and it took off like a rocket. It had sold nearly 500 copies before it was banned by Amazon on the 19th of November, less than a month later. Recognizing this was purely political, Amazon at the time already had 20 different books about Sandy Hook, 19 of which single authored, all as I recall, were one variation or another on the official narrative of the great tragedy of having these children and adults murdered at Sandy Hook. But the one book they banned was mine, with the 13 contributors, explaining in a highly detailed, systematic, very thoroughgoing fashion, copiously documented, that it in fact had been a FEMA drill. And it was
what was that music? Oh, that's your phone, I presume.
Yeah, that was my cell phone. I'm telling my friend I'm going to call him back as soon as I'm off the show with you. So yeah, just myself. Yeah. So I mean, we had abundant evidence, but recognizing this was a political stunt, I immediately released it for free as a PDF. And it was coincidental that I was going to be featured as a guest on Jeff Wrench's show that evening. So we announced that Amazon had banned the book and that I had released it for free as a PDF. In fact, for several years, Jeff Wrench was one of the websites where you could obtain the PDF for free as a download. It would eventually spread to 6 or 7 different sites altogether. This very same fellow, Leonard Pozner, has been very aggressive about trying to attack websites and videos that expose what's going on at Sandy Hook, where I learned during the discovery and his video deposition that he had been responsible for removing, get this, 1,555 videos from YouTube, the vast majority of which I'm certain had to do with Sandy Hook, and where during an interview he gave with a fellow whom we've identified as being involved in false flag operations in Europe, he boasted of, through his Honor Network, HONR Network, which he founded purportedly to support the victims of Sandy Hook, he boasted of having been responsible for taking down tens of thousands of content items from the internet, tens of thousands. So this guy, Leonard Pozner, whom I regard as a cyber terrorist, has been spearheading a massive censorship campaign to take down evidence from the internet. And very sad to say, YouTube has gone right along. In fact, Facebook similarly, Google generally. Twitter has been a bit of an exception, I'm pleased to report, in being very aggressive about trying to stomp out any research that relates to Sandy Hook in order to maintain the mythology of the official narrative. Now, there are all kinds of problems with the narrative from the beginning to the end, over and beyond those I've already mentioned, including, for example, that the alleged perpetrator, Adam Lanza, appears to be a creature of fiction. I believe if you've seen this purported image of his face, it looks more like a drawing than it does a photograph. It appears to me to be a skull that was kind of watercolored over to convey a kind of a subliminal deathly image. He is supposed to have weighed about 112 pounds, to have packed over 30 pounds of gear into the school, shot his way in They're supposed to have had a new security system, which oddly enough wasn't functioning. But the claim to a new security system was just nonsense. Since the school had been abandoned by 2008, there hadn't been any upgrading, and there was no new security system. And while he's supposed to have shot his way in through a plate glass window at the front of the school by the front doors, he is alleged to have done this with an AR-15, but in fact, it was like a slug from a shotgun, which even was embedded in a magazine rack there. So that we have lots of photographs of this purported entry where, it's evident because you can see the particles of glass lying on the flooring inside, and none of them is crushed. The furniture is all in place where it was originally. So not even Adam Lanza had entered the school through that rather large blowout with lots of jagged edges. Now, Wolfgang discovered that between 12 and 16, Connecticut state troopers signed affidavits that they had entered the school by going into that blown out hole in the front. But of course, it's completely ridiculous. I mean, they'd risk cutting their uniforms. State troopers, law enforcement officers generally take great pride in their uniforms. And as Wolfgang himself observed, the Three Stooges would have done better because they would have sent, say, Larry in, and he would come around and open the door for Joe and Bo. I mean, this whole story about Sandy Hook and these signed affidavits are ridiculous and a travesty. Wolfgang, by the way, was particularly good, and I think this comes from his background as an administrator in documenting the deplorable condition of the school. It was covered with moss, weeds. It was in an unkempt condition inside. There was all kinds of graffiti on the walls. The furniture was all jammed up against the walls or chucked into closets. We had videos about the inside and outside of the school up for, I would guess, around a year. And a number of comments came from former teachers who said, yes, that's exactly what they do with abandoned schools. They use them for storage. I noticed in addition, and this is like a very elegant proof that this was a scam, an aerial photograph of the parking lot. Shows, number one, there was no handicap parking. Well, I verified none of the blue and white familiar parking spaces or signage. I verified Connecticut state law for 2012, federal law for 2012. That building could not have been operating legally as a public school because it was in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Another observation from this photograph is it was a 38-degree ground temperature day. Now, that's above freezing, which, of course, is 32 degrees, but it's still pretty chilly. And you clearly could not have been conducting classes inside that building had it not been heated. But there's no heat or steam rising from the building, no doubt, because the boilers were so decrepit from non-use since 2008, they couldn't be fired up. A third striking feature, and some find this of the three to be the most convincing, though I give all three equal weight, is that there are two rows of cars in the middle, all parked facing the school. Now, if you follow the driving instructions coming in off of Dickinson Drive, which was the only access route for automobiles, then you'd have to turn right and curl around and then park facing away from the school. So the fact that you have these two rows of vehicles all parked facing the school is an obvious anomaly, easily explicable on the ground that it was simply much easier to bring all the vehicles in a single file and put them in 2 by 2 by 2. I mean, after all, who's even going to notice? They're just props. So just from that single aerial photograph, I submit you can determine that this was, in fact, not an operating school and that the whole business was, in fact, a scam. but we have dozens of proofs. I submit there must be 100 different lines of proof, probably many more, that lead to the conclusion that nobody died at Sandy Hook, that it was a mass casualty exercise involving children, as it states on the manual itself. Now, a photograph was taken by Shannon Hicks, who was the photographer, a journalist photographer for the Newtown Bee, which is a community newspaper, in which you can see what appears to be a string of about 15 children, where a woman who appears to be a policewoman seems to be leading them to safety. This photograph was sent around the world. It was published on the front page of the New York Times and virtually every other newspaper around the globe. Well, it didn't look right for a number of reasons, but because it didn't appear to be on this 38 below zero day in December. It looked more like it might have been taken in the fall. There are still some leaves on the tree. There's still some coloring on the tree. It just doesn't look quite right. Well, I was fascinated when I learned that there was a second photograph Shannon Hicks had taken, indeed just minutes earlier, and in the foreground of this second photograph, but the one that was actually chronologically taken first, you see a whole lot of parents in the foreground with their arms folded, their hands in their pockets, casually looking on at the string of kids, where the policewoman is actually rearranging the kids to get a better shot. So in the earlier photograph, there's a little girl in a pink sweater and a short skirt who's at the front of the line, but she's exchanged for a little boy who's taller with a dark sweater and blue jeans who is further back in the line. If you zoom in on this earlier photograph, you can even see a couple of parents in the background who appear to be sitting in chairs, casually looking on, leading me to describe this photograph as lounging at the massacre. I mean, it's ridiculous. If this had actually been a mass shooting and this were an emergency evacuation, I mean, what would the parents be doing there? Did somebody during this mass shooting decide I better pick up a phone and call some parents to rush right down? I mean, the very idea verges on idiocy. And if a parents had come down there and it had been an emergency, do you think any of them would be standing around with their hands in their pockets and their arms folded rather than grabbing their kids and getting the hell out of there as fast as possible? I mean, it's, in my opinion, conclusive proof that the whole event was staged. Shannon Hicks, who, by the way, has acknowledged having taken both of these photographs, would be presented with a Photographer of the Year award by the New England Newspaper Association for an obviously staged photograph. I mean, it's really unbelievably bad. Let me mention in passing, by the way, that the book can still be obtained one location or another. Do a search on Nobody Died at Sandy Hook PDF, where the beauty of the PDF is that then you get all the images in color and you can expand them or contract them as you like. The first printing of the book, which came from CreateSpace, by the way, a subsidiary of Amazon.com, making it all the more absurd that Amazon should ban the book on grounds they never specified. They simply wrote and said that I had violated their standards, but I never knew which standard was supposed to be violated and which was even perverse, given that the book had been produced by a subsidiary, CreateSpace. So this is just among the reasons I knew immediately that this was a political stunt to ban the book. So if you put in Nobody Died at Sandy Hook PDF, you'll be able to find it. I'll give you more information about where you can find yet more recent.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear, because to tell you the truth, I was actually planning at the end of this interview to ask you that if there was no way you could find the book, if you would be more than happy to send me a copy, I would be more than willing to play the role of book narrator and actually get it out there, verbalized, verbatim, out there on my own YouTube channel to help you out with that. But now I don't have to do that because you say it's actually available
Yeah,
through PDF.
yeah,
That's good to know.
and I'm in the peculiar position that a constraint has been imposed upon me about the not making the book available myself, and where, in fact, the publisher of the book, very much to my surprise and without my knowledge, actually settled in relation to the lawsuit that Pozner would bring against me, Mike Palachuk, and the publisher, where after Amazon banned our book, Mike and I realized we had to establish another outlet, and we founded Moon Rock Books, where you can now track it down at moonrockbooks.com online, where we've now published a dozen books. But perhaps the most important was Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, which we would subsequently publish a second edition in 2016, the following year, with several additional chapters and a couple subtractions, which was available right up to the time of the trial, but where in the process of working toward its conclusion, the publisher, unbeknownst to me, agreed to settle and included in settling that he would no longer sell Nobody Died at Sandy Hook in the first or the second edition. Now, that meant as I recall, the deadline was either the 1st of June or the 1st of July by which he had to vacate his stock. It may well have been the 1st of June. In any case, so the book is no longer available for retail. On the other hand, the PDF is available, as I've already mentioned in passing. Let me just say, in addition, therefore, while we're on the topic, that in 2018, I collaborated with Robert David Steele, quite a formidable intellect. He's a former CIA who has been promoting open source intelligence, meaning that all the intelligence work of the agencies should be made public or based upon publicly available records, which would be one form of emancipation from the tyranny of the deep state. He's become quite a serious and astute critic of the deep state. He's also been actively involved in efforts to defeat pedophilia, which is a worldwide phenomenon of which Pizzagate is the American franchise. And I've done enough research to guarantee you that Pizzagate is a real phenomenon, that its headquarters have been in Washington, D.C., at a couple of pizza parlors with common owners. And, aspects of this whole story become quite horrific. For our purpose, however, let me simply mention that Robert and I did a memorandum series on 9/11, and it was highly successful. I brought in about half of the contributors because I'd done quite a lot of work on 9/11, having been the founder of Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December 2015, where I invited Steve Jones, the physicist from BYU, to be my co-chair, and where the society took off like a rocket, where by the end of 2006, we had like 800 members in 4 different categories. I created a website, was responsible for the posting of every single item on the website so we could promote lectures, we could post videos, we could organize conferences, we would publish press releases, of which I authored, around 18. If you go to 911scholars.org, 911scholars.org, you'll find the website for Scholars for 9/11 Truth. In any case, Robert was very interested in doing current research on 9/11 as a memorandum series for the President of the United States. So we collaborated, and I brought in about half of the contributors, and it was quite a success, and it's available on his website. And after that, we debated. Robert was thinking he might like to do a memorandum series on JFK. And I actually, having, chaired or co-chaired 5 national conferences, having published 4 collections of expert studies, I was well positioned to bring together appropriate resources for that purpose. But while he really liked the outline, he thought even more timely would be to do a memorandum series about Sandy Hook. So we collaborated on that and put together in 2018 a memorandum series for the President of the United States, which you can also find on Robert David Steele's website. If you go for Sandy Hook POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, you'll be able to find it. So let me leave those resources at your disposal and return to the situation with a lawsuit and so forth.
Yeah, I really wanted to dedicate a lot of this interview to that, because obviously I didn't talk about that first time I had you on, because there was no lawsuit against you. And yeah, this is obviously it seems like a chilling effect to get people to shut up. Well, we're not going to shut up, and any attempt to silence me is going to fall on deaf ears, and I'm not going to give in any threats to have this interview moved from my video, or any threat of a lawsuit is not going to make me shut up either. So tell us anything that you can. I hope they haven't put any sort of gag order on you. And even if they did, I encourage you to violate it, because they're obviously trying to keep us from. Okay.
Let me put together a couple of the building blocks before we get there. In 2014, Wolfgang Halbig reached out to me to travel with him to Newtown, which we did together, to address the Newtown Board of Education. And while we were there, we visited the, I believe it's the Northwest Connecticut United Way, which had been the source of a lot of these contributions coming in from the public, where by law, their records are supposed to be publicly accessible. And nevertheless, when we went to the United Way in Newtown, they brought out 7 or 8 uniformed police officers from the Newtown Police Department to physically block Wolfgang Halbig from having access. I mean, look, if you want signs that things aren't right, that this whole situation is horribly wrong, there's a nice one. We also went to the Newtown Police Department because the 3 ranking officers, the 3 highest ranking, the chief and the assistant chief and so forth, had been involved in the Sandy Hook event. Well, while we were sitting there in the waiting room, we were told they were unavailable. Not that they were not present in the building, but that they were unavailable. They would not speak to Wolfgang and to me. We would make our way to the firehouse, which is just a third of a mile up the road, Dickinson Drive, from the elementary school, where the fire chief, possibly in the company of his daughter, because they're both EMT qualified, had rushed down to the school when they heard the reports had been blocked from entering the school. In fact, it was among the oddities of the event on 14 December that there was no surge of EMTs into the building. None were allowed into the building. There was no string of ambulances to rush their little bodies off to hospitals where they could be pronounced to be dead or alive. No medevac helicopter was called, even though, as Wolfgang has observed, they even call those choppers for drills. They laid out triage tarps, but no bodies of dead or wounded were ever placed upon them. Where Wayne Carver, the very subject of that blog by James Tracy that raised more questions than it answered, had explained that the parents weren't allowed to see the bodies of their children who were identified on the basis of photographs. And he emphasized, he said, I have very good photographers. Well, we discovered by and by that that was a key to the deception, because they faked the children out of photographs of older kids when they were younger. I demonstrated this in spades. After Kelly Watt, who turns out to be a key player in numerous different ways, including in relation to the lawsuit, Kelly Watt, who'd been contacted by Leonard Pozner and who initiated what would turn out to be about 100 hours of conversation, where she was telling him repeatedly that she didn't believe a word he said, didn't believe he had a son, didn't believe he died at Sandy Hook, asked for proof, asked for birth certificates, photographs of little Noah in the hospital with his mother, asked for the death certificate and so forth, where lo and behold, toward the end of this 100 hours of exchanges, he sent her a link and said, go to this blog. And she went to this website, Sandy Hook Facts, and there were several of the documents she'd requested, including a copy of a kindergarten report card. And she noticed right off the bat that the kindergarten report card misspelled the street, Dickinson, Dickinson. It was misspelled Enson, suggesting that the report card was a fabrication. There was indeed a death certificate there, and Kelly would share it with me. This occurred, by the way, in 2014. And a reason this was a big event is because the Newtown registrar, the registrar of vital statistics, Debbie Aurelia, was refusing to release any of the death certificates for the children. In fact, it would turn out that she'd actually entered into secret negotiations with the state legislature to not have to release death certificates for children, no doubt being aware that the issuance of a false death certificate is a crime. In any case, he shared this copy of the death certificate with Kelly, which we published in the book, and explained why it didn't look right to us in a chapter we jointly authored. And indeed, it would be things I said about the death certificate over which I would be sued, and which I'm now enjoying from reiterating, even though I believe they are true, as I said in court under oath during the trial for damages, which was subsequent to a summary judgment rendered by the court, independent of a jury, which was, in relation to the protocols for summary judgment, a wrongful action by the court, because the authenticity of the death certificate was massively disputed, and where I had the reports of two forensic document examiners confirming not only that my observations about that death certificate were correct, but that three other death certificates that had surfaced during the course of the case were also of a dubious character, to put it kindly, where if there are disputed facts in the case, and obviously I was being sued for denying the authenticity of the death certificate when I had ample expert evidence in support of my position, it had to be sent to a jury for determination. The judge nevertheless ruled, in my opinion, legally, completely improperly in favor of the plaintiff and granted a summary motion. That led to a trial for damages, which was highly perverse in many different aspects. And incidentally, let me just explain about the course of this whole trial. I mentioned how I welcomed the summons for a trial involving these issues, because as I outlined in my answer to the court, where when you're issued a complaint, you have two options. You can move to dismiss and give your reasons why, or you can join issues with an answer explaining how you plan to argue your case, where I laid out two lines of proof. The first line of proof was that we had ample evidence that it was a FEMA exercise during which no one had died, and that there was a massive evidence for this, which I recounted in these documents more than once. I mean, several times I laid out all this evidence. And I would therefore argue that I was not vulnerable to the defamation because truth is an absolute defense. And what I had said was true. I also explained a second line of defense would have to do with particular features related to this particular document that I would also argue substantiated my position. Now, you must understand I'm enjoined from asserting what I said over which I was sued, even though it's there in the public record. So I simply cannot say it, but you get the drift. You understand my position here. So Mike and I sought high and low to find legal representation. Now, our publisher had to have legal representation because in a legal matter, a company cannot represent itself. We as individuals could represent ourselves, a status known as pro se, P-R-O-S-E, meaning representing oneself, which Mike and I did because we were searching high and low to find an attorney, and no one would represent us, undoubtedly because this was such a political hot potato, where Sandy Hook skeptics are looked askance by the public, virtually as though we were worse than bank robbers or child molesters. I mean, it's simply absurd. You would think the public would value whistleblowers about events as monstrous as staging a phony exercise, where we produce ample evidence that this was a Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Eric Holder, Newtown Board of Education, Connecticut governor, Connecticut State Police operation involving FEMA to create an emotionally powerful event in order to build a case for gun control.
Right. And let me stop you right there for a moment because I know what it's like to have the public or individuals in the public go against you if you even if you provide great evidence. I had a case where I was talking about Sandy Hook with someone, and they asked me, how can you say nobody died at Sandy Hook? And the first thing I did was provide a link to the FBI report that said that nobody was murdered in 2012 in the town that Sandy Hook
in Newtown, in Newtown.
And
Sandy Hook has,
right. And next thing I knew, all the person did was say, "Don't ever talk to me again," and then unfriended me from Facebook, either because they can't handle the truth or because they were speechless and they just it was one of those forget I even met you kind of things. But since I mentioned
but Andrew, look at the absurdity of that. You're simply citing the FBI, the Federal Department of Investigation's Consolidated Crime Report for 2012, where for Connecticut, in the state of Connecticut, the town of Newtown, the intersection with murders and non-negligent homicides is 0, which means, of course, by implication, since Sandy Hook is a subdivision of Newtown, that there were no murders in Newtown in 2012. And of course, if Sandy Hook had been real, there ought to have been a number 27, for example. Adam Lanza, suicides, I gather, are actually classified as murder, as a murder of a person of himself. So I think you would have had the 26 plus Adam Lanza, 27. Remember, he's supposed to have also murdered his mother in her bed. I'll return to that because we have a whole lot of photographic evidence that the house was just an empty home that was furnished for the occasion of serving as a prop. And where in the photograph of the Nancy Lanza bedroom where Adam is supposed to have shot her in the head with a .22 caliber rifle multiple times. There's a little bit of red stuff on the bed, but it doesn't appear to be blood. I suspect it's raspberry jam. And if you go to the foot of the bed, there's a cedar chest that has a set of forms on it, which we find in many of the other photographs, because they appear to have been keeping records about how they arranged each of the rooms. But where Kelly Watt, the very same person who had that 100 hours of conversation with Leonard Pozner, who has her own home and commercial cleaning service with her keen eye spotted a blue moving pad beneath the leg of the bed that in their haste they'd forgotten to remove. I mean, it's that bad. So that in the book, in chapter 7, there are 50 photographs of furnishing an empty house to serve as the Adam Lanza residence, including most strikingly that photograph of the Nancy Lanza bedroom. And then in chapter 8, we have another 50 photographs of them refurbishing the school to serve as the stage. And it even includes the moving vans pulling up. You can see the name tag of the moving van company on the doorknobs and so forth. I mean, it's really stunning how much. Now, this was all put together by William Powell, who turned out to be a completely brilliant student of Sandy Hook. And where at the time he was providing these photographs, I did not know their origin. It turns out they actually came from the Connecticut State Police files, because the Connecticut State Police were running the whole op, and they're taking photographs of everything they did, including, and this to me is the most stunning photograph of them all, in the parking lot in front of the school. You see this crime scene investigation van, or SWAT van. I mean, it's a very large, substantial, hefty van. In the middle of the parking lot, just above the roof, you can see a series of 4 windows in classroom 10 that are undamaged. That's significant because after the event, they'd be shot up. The second pane in particular would be completely shot up. But it would be quite obvious if this were the windows before or the windows after the purported event. And they're clearly the windows before the purported event. You go to the flag, which is at full mast. You come down the flag and you track, and there's a familiar-looking figure with his arms folded, leaning against the wall, that I am quite certain is Wayne Carver, the medical examiner, awaiting the arrival of his portable mortuary tent. And there is crime scene tape up for a crime that is yet to be committed. So, I mean, what could you have as more glaring proof? We also have photographs of the windows before and the windows after, so you can compare for yourself. And also, we have a photograph of several of the perps squatting down, looking at the window as to what they're going to do about it, and a subsequent photograph where you have pink rods extending from holes they've drilled in the aluminum window frames, where each of the rods is exactly perpendicular to the window frame and parallel to the other 2 rods, meaning it's a fantasy scenario for a shooting event that they just created using a drill. Now, I say this with a considerable authority, having served as a Marine Corps officer, including as a series commander, where I had 15 drill instructors and 300 recruits under my command going through the training cycle, including marksmanship training at Camp Pendleton, Edson Range Camp Pendleton. And no one familiar with firearms would believe this was the result of an actual shooting, but it would rather be obvious that it was a prop. It was staged. Now, in the first edition, we believe that photograph had been taken the morning of the 14th. Objections were made to that date time, and based upon shadow analysis in the second edition, I corrected to show it was actually taken in the evening of the 13th, the night before. In other words, they were setting things up for the event that would take place the following day. But what could be more devastating proof that this was fake than that you have the crime scene vehicle on the scene before the crime has been committed. I mean, I submit. When the book was banned, among the notable outlets that covered the banning of the book was where Mike Adams, Natural News, was absolutely the best. He ran a couple of articles about it. He interviewed me about it. He was the best. Where InfoWars published a piece about it, the book having been banned, and they used that same image of the crime scene vehicle there in the parking lot before the crime had yet to occur. And in fact, I thought the quality of their image was even better than my own. Well, the story about the banning of the book was up for about 39 minutes. It already had received something like 138 comments before it was taken down. I already had a copy of it, and when I went back to review it, I felt I detected the reason it was taken down, because it said right on the photograph, image credit Connecticut State Police. Now, Andrew, that rather blows the whole story, does it not? So there you have
Right,
Connecticut's.
right.
Yeah.
I also wanted to point out something about that thing I mentioned about the FBI statistics suggesting that the events were staged because nobody was murdered in that year in 2012 in Newtown. Just like how it was done by someone in the 9/11 Truth Movement to call the FBI and ask their chief of investigative publicity why Osama bin Laden's most wanted poster did not mention the 9/11 attacks, and the answer they got was because the FBI has no hard evidence to connect bin Laden to the attacks on 9/11. Has anybody actually tried to contact the FBI's chief of investigative publicity on this issue and ask them why don't the murders at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, why aren't they included in the murders that in the statistics for the number of people that were murdered in 2012? And anybody tried to see what the answer would have been from the FBI, or if they have tried, have they ignored them?
I mean, the report appears to be completely authentic and consistent with all the evidence we've emerged. There have been efforts to try to debunk it by claiming that there's a footnote in the records somewhere alluding to the 27 victims. But if there were 27 victims who died in 2012, then the number would have appeared in the table for the consolidated crime statistics for Connecticut for Newtown, and murder, where it does not appear. I can tell you quite a lot, by the way, about Osama, who, by the way, was our man in Afghanistan. He was instrumental in getting Stinger missiles into the hands of the Mujahideen they used to shoot down Soviet helicopters and tanks, and drove the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. He was actually an officer in the CIA. His name was Colonel Tim Osman. He was visited by an official of the agency in a hospital in Dubai, where he was suffering from the medical maladies for which he would die shortly thereafter, on or about 15 December 2001. He was suffering, from kidney problems, and it's tough to get dialysis machines in and out of those caves in Afghanistan. He was buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with Muslim tradition. There were local obituaries about it, both Fox News and CNN. On 26 December 2001, published the report that Osama bin Laden was dead. We tracked what would occur thereafter as the organization scholars, and I wrote one or more press releases about the fake bin Ladens that were surfacing in consultation with a leading expert about Osama, who was on the faculty at Duke University. And where Nick Kollerstrom, this celebrated historian of science, who's a leading among the world's leading experts on Sir Isaac Newton, and he's particularly strong in the history of physics and astronomy, but who is also the leading expert on the London 7/7 subway bombing, where his book Terror on the Tube, now in its third or even fourth edition, has been a bestseller, actually cracked the case discovering that the four young Muslim lads had apparently been hired to play a role in a drill, where it's astonishing how the attacks on the tube stops and the simulated events of the drill corresponded exactly, virtually to the minute, had been unable to be present for their assigned role because a train from Luton they had to take to get into London had been canceled that day. So the whole story of 7/7 is completely preposterous.
Absolutely.
There's an absolutely wonderful video about it by Maud Dibb entitled "The 7/7 Ripple Effect," where you can see in 1 hour the going from the beginning of the planning of the drill to the execution of the actual killing, and where these young lads, realizing they'd been played, sought to get to Canary Wharf, to the international news services that are located there, to tell them what had happened, but the bobbies blocked them off and shot them dead. Now, Nick published on my blog a very nice piece about Osama bin Laden, 1947 to 2001, where we featured a number of photographs of the fake bin Ladens, and where David Ray Griffin, who is the dean of 9/11 studies, has among his dozen books on 9/11 included one, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive, addressing the issue. When they put out this movie, Zero Dark 30, I'd had enough, and I published a piece, Zero Dark 30, The Deeper, Darker Truths, explaining that the raid that it was lionizing on the compound in Pakistan had been completely staged, where they'd even taken a fake photograph in a conference room off of the Oval Office, where you had all the prime members of the Obama administration, including Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, Joe Biden, Vice President, and so forth, seeming to appear intensely at a large screen television. It was published around the world that they were following the event in real time until Leon Panetta, who was then the director of the CIA, revealed that there'd been no live coverage for the first 20 to 25 minutes, which corresponded with the entire lapsed time of the operation. The members of the community said they'd never seen Osama bin Laden. A photograph they had of a man with a television remote control in his hand was not Osama, but the owner of the compound. It was all completely rigged and faked in order to position Barack Obama for a triumphal re-election by having taken out the most dangerous man in the world, right? I mean, all fake. It had the effect of nullifying criticisms to which he was being subjected at the time, including about not having closed Guantanamo, but where it was really Republicans who wouldn't let him close it, about having troops stationed in Pakistan, claiming to have used those. So, gee, I guess we're glad those troops are there and that the Guantanamo is still open. And wiping questions about his birth certificate, his Hawaiian birth certificate, which for a certainty is a fabrication, off of the front page, at least if you were considering the alternative media, and positioning him as being the triumphant killer of Osama. I believe, by the way, that Donald Trump was set up for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani by Bibi Netanyahu, telling him that he could similarly position himself for a triumphal re-election by taking out this guy, whom Bibi would be describing as the greatest terrorist in the world. In fact, he was the second most influential political figure in Iran. He's a completely brilliant general and probably the greatest master of counterterrorism the world has ever known. He was instrumental in using various disparate forces of Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia to take out ISIS, which, for those who missed the memo, was created by the United States to be a terrorist army to put pressure on Bashar al-Assad, who, again, if you do not know, is a democratically elected president of Syria. When Tulsi went to meet with Bashir, she was demonized as meeting with a dictator, but he's not a dictator. He's a democratically elected president. which also means we can't be bringing freedom and democracy to Syria because Syria already is a democracy. So much of what we get from the mainstream media is cock and bull that it's, useful to go back and review the bidding periodically. Now, it was an act of treachery by the United States because Soleimani was on a peace mission. He was flying commercial. He was the guest of the prime minister of Iraq. The assassination took place on Iraqi soil and thereby violated Iraqi sovereignty. But even more strikingly, and I've made this point on numerous occasions, in fact, recently in relation to addressing a group of students in Iran, that because this was an act of war, of a preemptive attack on Iran by the United States, with which the United States is not at war, it's only permissible under the UN Charter under two conditions. First, if we had approval of the UN Security Council, of which Russia, China, other great nations are members, which of course didn't happen, would not have happened. Or second of all, if we confronted an imminent attack that required an immediate response. But not only was there no imminent threat from Soleimani, he was there on a peace mission, and we were thereby also violating the sovereignty of Iraq. And because we are connected to the UN and its charter by a treaty, and because under the Constitution, treaties have the same status under the law as the Constitution itself, he violated his oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He himself, Donald Trump, an action that was violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the rules of war. Not only that, but the sanctions that Trump has imposed on Iran, like the sanctions that were previously imposed upon Iraq, which had the effect of leading to the death of 500,000 Iraqis, most of whom were children, which Madeleine Albright, when questioned on 60 Minutes, cheerfully said, oh, yes, it had been worth it, the 500,000 Iraqi lives, are violations of the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter again, because it's a form of collective punishment. In other words, you're punishing the people, the population of a country, for the acts of their political leaders. That is verboten. That is illegal. That is wrong. Again, it violates the UN Charter. So while the Democrats, did this nonsense about abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, which were virtually meaningless, those do not have well-defined meaning under the law, and in particular in relation to impeachment proceedings, where the Constitution specifies high crimes and misdemeanors, bribery, torture, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, of which Trump was guilty of none, but where, irony of ironies, Joe Biden committed precisely that when he, during a visit to Ukraine, threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. foreign aid unless the prosecutor who was looking into Burisma were fired before he got on his plane, which was scheduled to depart in 6 hours hence. And he boasted about this on the Council on Foreign Relations, turning to the audience and saying, son of a bitch, they did it. They fired him. Well, this is all completely outrageous because there was a blatant quid pro quo. Trump did not have one. The most important witnesses, Vandeman, Sonderland, and the woman ambassador, all three, when asked if there were anything illegal about the phone call or if there were anything impeachable about it, remained silent. The whole dog and pony show should have ended right at that point in time because there was no case. And the Democrats who moved forward with this, claiming it was of grave insurgency and a threat to national security, once the articles were past Nancy Pelosi, did not move them, send them to the Senate for a month, Now, that's really quite peculiar, even perverse, if you stop and ask yourself what in the world's going on, because they were claiming this was all a matter of the greatest urgency. And then it's delayed for a month. Well, I'm convinced what happened was the Hollywood scriptwriters took over at that point in time. If you paid attention to their presentation, it was too smooth. It was too well crafted. One presentation followed after another as though it had been scripted. They had one visual feature like a PowerPoint as though it had been scripted. The explanation, because it was scripted. My nominee for the producer is Rob Reiner. I believe he had a few zingers that were contributed by, arch anti-Trump Hollywood figures like Robert De Niro. In any case, the outcome has been devastating for the Democrats. I mean, this past week has been absolutely shattering. And I think if they had any remote prospects of defeating Trump, they are long since torn and tattered. Where, for example, even during the impeachment in Times Square, a huge billboard was erected playing over and over Biden's boasting about this event in Ukraine on a huge billboard in Times Square. And where Biden, of course, now is wound up finishing fourth in Iowa, and where it's rather obvious to me that the use of this new app designed by this outfit called Shadow Incorporated, which is staffed by former Hillary and Obama people who had actually worked for them in their administration or on their campaign, was to guarantee that Bernie, to sabotage Bernie's campaign so he wouldn't come in first. Well, they've now finally released at least 96%, and it was showing what, 26.2% to 26.1% at one point, giving Buttigieg a slight lead. But Bernie has now observed he has a 6,000 vote margin over Buttigieg, and he's declared himself a victor. This is what they were trying to stave off, because now he's going into New Hampshire. He has a major lead. So Bernie is going to come out of Iowa when it's properly tabulated, but where he already has the moral victory, and New Hampshire, and no doubt Nevada, poised to be challenged in South Carolina, but where Biden has now been so damaged by all the evidence and information about corruption in Ukraine, which appears to implicate a number of other Democrats, not only Joe Biden and his son Hunter, where a new report even explains how Joe Biden was promoting Hunter's business activities from the vice president's office when he was, in the executive branch. I mean, it all shows everything he's been claiming is totally fabricated. And where now members of the Senate have requested travel records for Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, including Ron Johnson, who's a senator from the state where I reside here in Wisconsin, who's proving his mettle. This guy has proved to be a much better senator than I had imagined. And he's not an easy guy to affect, meaning he takes time to make up his mind, and he's resolute. He is among two major senators who are going to be pursuing an investigation of the corruption of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, their activities in Ukraine, which I guarantee you will prove to be corrupt. So all this is going on. Then there's this magnificent State of the Union. I mean, some have described it as the most eloquent State of the Union they ever heard. Donald Trump is a master of the media. He's a genius at public relations. I was distraught by the part about Iran, because I reiterate, he's actually boasting about these acts he committed that are violations of international law, the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter, and are bona fidely impeachable events. But the Democrats aren't going there because they support all these things. The Democrats have become the war party. Indeed, in a way, it's a miracle Trump was elected, but he was elected because of his promise to get us out of the wars in the Middle East. studies by Boston University and the University of Minnesota have confirmed that it was voters in rural counties in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin that had suffered many casualties from these wars who voted for Trump in high numbers in the expectation or belief that he was the less likely of the two candidates to continue those wars, about which there's no doubt. They were correct, but I've been very, very disturbed by the extent to which Trump has been under the influence of Bibi Netanyahu, leaving me in a bit of a dilemma because I believe Trump has done a tremendous amount of good for the United States. He's revived the economy, unemployment at record low. We even have reports from black likely voters. This was a Rasmussen poll. 34% of black likely voters were indicating they were going to support Trump, which is devastating news for the Democrats. 83% of the farmers support Trump. I mean, the figures go on. He's getting his highest approval ratings now in history. It was 49% in the wake of the impeachment. It's going to go 50 or higher because of the State of the Union. So as far as, handling himself, he's doing an absolutely brilliant job. The Democrats don't appear to have any candidate who could touch him. Irony of ironies. I mean, Bernie, I think, could have given Trump a run for his money in 2016, but as most of the world is aware, Andrew, Debbie Wasserman Schultz sabotaged Bernie's campaign. She shifted 13 primaries Bernie had won to Hillary's column to guarantee she would be the nominee. They were doing all kinds of faking for Hillary. She would have, for example, a rally in St. Petersburg, Florida that would draw 300, while Trump would be having a rally in Boca Raton that was drawing 30,000. So they'd actually go and Photoshop the images from St. Petersburg to make it appear as though Hillary's crowds were just as large and enthusiastic as Trump's, which is completely ridiculous and the opposite. I do believe that because Bernie's foreign policy overlapped Donald's at that point in time, and Bernie also being a non-interventionist, wanting to get us out of the wars, and because his domestic policies, by and large, are far more attractive to the American people, I felt that had the Democratic Party allowed Bernie Sanders to be their nominee, he might, very well have beaten Donald Trump and be president today. Instead, they're trying to sabotage his campaign again, and they did it through this very bizarre abuse of this app coming from Shadow. I mean, Hillary even entertains the idea that she might herself be nominated by a brokered convention to save the party. She's still convinced she could beat Trump. But it turns out that this is all an illusion and something that everyone needs to bear in mind. I think Trump at this point is basically unbeatable. I certainly do not believe that Mini Mike, as the Donald refers to Michael Bloomberg, whom I'm given to understand is only 5'6" tall. He was, suggesting that he's trying to buy the nomination when it's absolutely true. He's trying to buy the nomination. And where Trump mockingly suggested he was also negotiating to have a stand, a box for a stand he could be on if he appeared during the debates to make himself appear taller. I mean, Trump has a way of getting people's goats. I mean, it's just phenomenal how he's with Sleepy Joe. Hannity calls him quid pro quo Joe. Anyway, you can stick a fork in him because Joe Biden is done. His goose is cooked. And Buttigieg, who I agree is a highly intelligent guy. He's very articulate. He seems to be a thoughtful guy. Those are on the plus side. But he's, of course, openly gay. And at least that wasn't true of Barack Obama. He has a man for a husband. That was true, but not openly true of Barack, because Michelle was born Michael Robinson, actually played football at Michigan at Oregon State before transferring to Princeton and adopting a female persona. I've done a lot of research on this. We have photographs of them together before she began presenting herself as a female. We have a report from her physician during a campaign where he walked into her in a trailer in Trenton where she was taking a pee standing up. And he wanted the world to know, although he's been paid millions for his silence, that Michelle Obama is not a transgender. He's not a man who was turned into a woman, but Michelle Obama is a man with breast implants. So, anyone who thinks Michelle is going to ride to the savior of the party, which I have seen many times the idea being planted, or that Hillary Clinton could do it, where she may be the most corrupt of all candidates to ever run for the highest office, and that's saying something, given the number of corrupt individuals, including Lyndon Baines Johnson, who actually was responsible. He was the mastermind behind the assassination of JFK, where he forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960 in order to have Jack taken out so he could accede to the presidency. Jack had already decided to invite the senator from Missouri to be his running mate, Stuart Symington, but he gave him overnight to think about it, where Bobby went by the Johnson suite to extend a pro forma, just as a gesture, invitation to run with JFK. He was dumbfounded when LBJ jumped on it, and he threatened to expose that Jack had Addison's disease and therefore was not expected to live a long, healthy life, that among his many dalliances with beautiful women was a spy for East Germany, and information he got from J. Edgar Hoover, and even that if he were not on the ticket, that any legislative proposal sent down from the White House would be dead on arrival, because in his position as a powerful majority leader, he would bottle them up. Well, Bobby and Jack tried to figure a way around it, but Lyndon had him boxed in, and he had to rescind the invitation to Symington to be his running mate, the only time in his political career he ever had to reverse himself on a political decision. Meanwhile, one of Lyndon's wealthy backers, when he learned that he would be running with JFK, burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing, because now LBJ would be helping John F. Kennedy become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later boast in public that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. And in the course of events, Lyndon Johnson sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. So we've had very corrupt individuals occupy the office of president before, but none, I think, who was as corrupt as Hillary Clinton. Now, the risk that the public needs to understand is the following. Robert Epstein, who is the editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, he's a behavioral science with 30 to 40 years of research experience, has reported what he describes as the most stunning behavioral effect he's ever observed, where Google has been able to use its algorithm to affect the outcome of our votes. He reported to Congress, and he also has a PDF, a written report, but you can find online. Just do a search for Robert Epstein testimony to Congress. There's his opening statement in one YouTube that's still up. There is his being questioned by Ted Cruz in another YouTube that's still up. He explains that already in 2016, Google was responsible for adding between 2.6 and 10.4 million votes to the Democrats. So if you want to know why Hillary took the popular vote, it wasn't Hillary, it was Google. He also explains it appears that in 2018, the reason the Democrats retook the House of Representatives was because Google was again affecting the vote. Now, here's how they do it, as he explained. They can, at the mere push of a button, send out go vote reminder to hundreds of millions of people. And if they only send the go vote reminder to the Democrats, the party they favor, it can have this staggering influence on the election, and it's invisible. It doesn't cost a dime. And he has observed that they didn't go all out in the past, but you can be assured they're going to go all out for 2020. So I think that's what we have to fear, that we don't have to be concerned. Someone is messing with the vote here in the United States, but it isn't Russia. It actually is Google and, of course, Israel, which has been manipulating our media forever. Indeed, the CIA began infiltrating the mainstream media back in the 1950s with Operation Mockingbird, such that by 1975, William Colby, then the agency's director, testified to Congress that the agency owned everyone of any significance in the media. That was followed by a report by the co-author of Carl Bernstein in Rolling Stone, entitled "The CIA and the Media," where Bernstein was reporting that the highest officials of the agency were boasting that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. And anyone aware of the state of the media at that era knows that if you controlled Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS, you pretty much had a lock on the dissemination of the news in the United States. Now, with the emergence of the internet, that complete domination has been massively threatened, which is why it has now become so important for the deep state to censor the internet, which is going to require some very definitive response. Because when the internet was created, these social media were given special treatment as neutral platforms. They would be like libraries. Everyone could publish their own books and they'd be available in the library, but only the author of the book would be responsible for its content, not the library. But now they are censoring so many books. I mean, my book on Sandy Hook was only the first. If you go to moonrockbooks.com, of the 12 volumes we have published as of today, Amazon.com has banned 6. 6 of them. They've not only banned Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, and Nobody Died in Boston either, about the Boston bombing. They had banned the book Political Theater in Charlottesville. They banned the book From Orlando to Dallas and Beyond. They banned the book about the Parkland puzzle, putting the pieces together. They've even banned the book, And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either. So I'm just telling you, it's absolutely stunning. I want you to think of Moonrock Books as your conspiracy catalog. If you want to find out what really happened, what I do, what I specialize in, and I've done it again and again and again, I bring together the best experts on different aspects of these cases and publish collections of our collaborative research, where when you discover that the research of these independent investigators all converges on the same conclusions, which I summarize in the prologues to these books, then you understand you really have a handle on what's going on. In other words, I am promoting a form of research that has never been undertaken before. I have sometimes referred to it as assassination science, in the sense of applying the principles of scientific reasoning to the assassination of JFK, for example. You can find a very nice illustration in the article Reasoning About Assassinations, which you can download for free from the internet, Reasoning About Assassinations, which was a presentation I gave at Cambridge during an international conference in the United Kingdom that was published in a peer-reviewed international journal, about how if you simply locate where JFK was shot in the back, given other uncontroversial facts about the case, it's easy to establish this was a there were two or more shooters and therefore a conspiracy. If you want a more extended explanation of the application of scientific method to the study of conspiracies, I have another piece you can also download for free from the internet entitled Thinking About Conspiracy Theories, 9/11 and JFK, where I use JFK as an illustration of the technique, which involves 4 steps or stages, and then turn to 9/11. The first stage being puzzlement. There's something that occurs that doesn't fit into your background knowledge that seems to require an explanation not readily at hand or apparent. Speculation, where you consider all the full range of alternatives as to what might have brought about this heretofore inexplicable phenomenon. Third stage, adaptation, where you adapt the alternative hypotheses to the evidence after sorting out the authentic from the inauthentic evidence. That's absolutely crucial. And indeed, once you've taken that step, usually the cases fall pretty straightforwardly into place, because the only reason they were mysterious or difficult to resolve was because of a massive fabricated evidence. Then the fourth stage is when all the evidence is settled out and points in the same direction, you're entitled to accept the best supported hypothesis as true, but in the tentative, infallible fashion of science, meaning fallible, even though it's the best supported hypothesis and you're entitled to accept it as true, it might eventually turn out to be false. Tentative in the sense that with the acquisition of new evidence or alternative hypotheses, you may have to revive your previously accepted hypotheses and accept others you previously rejected while leaving others in suspense. Now, here's a very trivial example of the application of these procedures, which are typical to the scientific investigation of crimes. Suppose you find a body lying in a studio apartment, for example, and it has bruises around the neck, but it has no bullet holes, no knife wounds. You might consider what brought about the death of this person. Well, the hypothesis, what's the probability that the person was shot given there are no bullet holes in the body? Well, obviously the answer is 0. What's the probability this individual was stabbed, given there are no stab wounds in the body? Well, obviously the answer is, again, 0. Well, what's the probability then this individual is strangled, given there are bruise marks around the throat? Well, in this case, clearly not 0. So at that particular point, the best supported hypothesis among the 3 as to cause of death would be strangulation. However, if during autopsy it turned out that the party had been poisoned, that actually he was dead because of the poisoning and that the bruises around the neck were an artifact but not the cause of death, then you'd have a nice illustration of the fallible and tentative character of conclusions. But in that case, we were actually drawing one prematurely for the sake of illustration, because you wouldn't have enough evidence prior to autopsy to conclude that it had been strangulation, even though you would have enough evidence prior to autopsy to conclude that the man was not shot and was not stabbed. Now, in the case of JFK, what we discovered was that the autopsy x-rays for JFK had been altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout to the back of the head. We had many witnesses in Dealey Plaza, at Parkland Hospital, even at Bethesda, who reported a fist-sized blowout at the back of the head. Even Clint Hill, who was the first to observe it up close and personal, when he rushed up on the back of the car, pushed Jackie back, and then lay down across their bodies, reported observing this massive gaping wound at the back of JFK's head, and that it was obvious this was a mortal wound. So that when he observed this, he turned to the other agents in the motorcade and gave them a thumbs down. Well, we had all these witness reports, but the Warren Commission rejected them on the ground that the autopsy x-rays didn't show it. And while, of course, normally autopsy x-rays are the best evidence, in this instance, they were not because they've been altered. In fact, David W. Mantik, who has both an MD and a PhD in physics from Wisconsin, right here in Madison, an MD from Michigan, and who's board certified in radiation oncology, which is treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, which means he's an expert on the interpretation of X-rays, had told me before he entered the National Archives for the first time in November of 2002 that he believed he would find both evidence that the autopsy had been altered and of a second shot to the head, which he did indeed discover, and where a world authority on the human brain concluded that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives, where the original brain seems to have mysteriously disappeared, though there may be a relatively innocuous explanation that Bobby may have had it reinterred with a body when they created the eternal flame and so forth, is not the brain of JFK. Plus, we have a physician who was in trauma room number 1 when the moribund body was brought in, and then 2 days later was responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald, who in addition contributed a chapter to that first book, Assassination Science, which I published in 1998, in which he reported and provided to me diagrams of the wound to the throat, which was a small, clean puncture wound, before and after the tracheostomy, which was a simple, clean, straight-line incision that did not distort the wound, and of the blowout at the back of the head from both the back and from the side. So, once you start going here, I mean, these first 3 books of mine, Assassination Science, 1998, Murder in Dealey Plaza, 2000, and The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, 2003, even Vincent Bugliosi, who is the celebrated prosecutor of Charles Manson and author of the book Helter Skelter, who also published a 1,500-page tome in which he claimed to resurrect the Warren Commission report findings, acknowledge in passing that mine were the only exclusively scientific books ever published on the death of JFK. I only wish he had taken their conclusions to heart. So what I'm saying is, we've discovered in the case of Sandy Hook, the situation is similar. There's a lot of fabricated and fake evidence, including.
Yeah, can I hold you up for just a moment?
Of course,
because I have one issue in particular that I need to address with you regarding Sandy Hook that I was going to address at a conference that I unfortunately got kicked out of shortly after getting there, because they checked my social media and they thought I wasn't compatible with the conference. It was the Tea Party conference that took place in the summer of 2018. I wanted to go there to get back to my Patriot community roots and make a statement about it, but apparently they checked my social media, and even though I support pretty much everything the Tea Party does from a political standpoint, because I am open-minded and I'll talk about all kinds of crazy things with far-out guests on my show and all that, and because the Tea Party likes to be naturally narrow-minded and conservative narrow-minded, they thought I was a bad fit, so they gave me my $200 refund and told me to beat it. Well, that may have actually been a good thing, come to think of it, because I had a feeling some crazy shit would happen if I had stuck around and done what I was planning to do. And I ask you to help me with this. I did, by the way, send you an email about this. You never responded to it. I don't know if you saw it or maybe you missed it, but asking you if you could help me make sense of what this was about. One of the people that was going to speak at that conference, in the Tea Party conference, was a man claiming to be a relative of someone who died at Sandy Hook. The person's name was J.T. Lewis, and this person actually is a supporter of gun rights, which seems counterintuitive. You'd think that people who had relatives who died at Sandy Hook would be against gun rights and would want guns to be banned, but this person wanted the Second Amendment to be supported when they had a relative died at Sandy Hook. And my plan was, this was going to be the last person speaking, was actually to say, For your information, sir, there is a book out by Jim Fetzer called Nobody Died at Sandy Hook. And if that's true, then, well, you're not who you claim you are. Now, if that had happened, all hell probably would have broken out at the conference. I can only imagine what it would have been. But this J.T. Lewis guy, if nobody died at Sandy Hook, he couldn't be the relative of someone who died at Sandy Hook. So do you think maybe you can help me, if you know anything about this, make sense of who that person is and why would they support gun rights if they allegedly had someone, a relative?
Well, there was an alleged decedent among the children, Jesse Lewis. Let's see, his father testified to Congress, and he had a huge photograph of him and his child about a year after. Now, the child, of course, would have been, since it was an infant, about 6 years older than seen in the photograph, since the kids who died were first graders. The vast majority were six years old. And yet, if you looked at him in relation to the photograph, he looked much more than 6 years older. He looked like he might be 16 or 20 yeyears older. So that I believe that photograph of him testifying to Congress, if you understand what he's holding and the age, the time spans involved here, is self-refuting. It's interesting. There would be anyone who would be in that community supporting the Second Amendment. The community appears to have been a synthetic community that was put together piece by piece, that they brought players in from diverse locations and gave them homes in which to reside. And of course, in terms of the payoff, already on January 16th of 2013, Barack Obama signed no less than 23 executive orders to constrain our access to weapons under the Second Amendment. Perhaps you can resend that email to me, Andrew. I get 100 emails every day, sometimes more. So I occasionally miss one, especially if it's a reply to something I sent before. I may miss it. In fact, I've been, dismayed that I found, much later a response that I'd overlooked inadvertently as a consequence. So, you probably would have created quite a tumult at the time. The most important point to make, I think, is the book is an edited book, so that when, in fact, the media went to town about this after the trial for damages was conducted, during which they even projected one of the images of this Noah Pozner, whom Kelly Watt, once again, I remind you, who had the 100 hours with Noah, who noticed a blue moving pad beneath the leg of the Nancy Lanza bed, to whom Lenny gave a copy of Noah's death certificate, which we published in the book. Also noticed a striking resemblance between Noah Pozner and Michael Vabner, who is supposed to be his older stepbrother. So that in the second edition of the book published in 2016, the last appendix D, is an essay by Kelly where she's making the observation that they appear to be the same person. And now she's shown these photographs to many of her friends, and they say, and she says, do these people look related, or do you see anything striking here? And they all say, oh, yeah, that's the same person grown up. But so, in fact, Noah Pozner is Michael Vabner as a child. 6 of us went to work on this. We established they had the same eyes, they had the same eyebrows, they had the same nose, they had the same mouth, they had the same ear, they had the same shape of size of skull. So I sent 2 photographs, completely unidentified. I didn't explain the context at all, to a colleague of mine by the name of Larry Rivera, who has mastered the principles of photogrammetry, which is the application of mathematics to the study of photographs, and has been able to verify that the man in the doorway, whom we had concluded on the basis of the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the T-shirt he was wearing, which appeared to be the same as the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the T-shirt of Lee Oswald when he was arrested, was indeed Lee Oswald, by finding photographs that gave him the right perspective to do a superposition of the facial images, which is affected by setting the distances between their pupils the same. So you fix the interpupillary distances between the eyes the same. And if it's the same person, all their features are going to fall into place. He's illustrated the power of this method with photographs of, for example, two different pictures that don't really look that they are the same Marilyn Monroe, but indeed you set the interpupillary distance and you superimpose them, and it is one and the same, two photographs of Marilyn Monroe. Or you take a photograph of J. Lo and another person who might look somewhat like her. You'll see immediately that it's not the same person. Well, the government has insisted that the figure in the doorway, this was captured in a famous photograph by AP photographer James Alison. It's known technically as Alison 6 because it's supposed to be the sixth in a series of 7 photographs he took, but he can't remember taking the 7th, which appears to be a completely fabricated photograph attributed to him after the fact. Is indeed Lee Oswald standing in the doorway. When he superimposes the features of Lee Oswald, it turns out to be Lee Oswald, the nose, the eyes, the ears, the jaw, they all fit hand in glove. If you superimpose the image of Billy Lovelady, his co-worker, who said himself he thought it was odd they'd be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, and moreover had been wearing a short-sleeved red and white vertically striped shirt, completely different than the long-sleeved, richly textured, tattered, and worn shirt on the man in the doorway on the day of the assassination. It's clearly not Billy Lovelady. The ear is too low, the jaw doesn't fit, the nose is wrong. So Larry's done brilliant work. Well, given his background, I sent him these 2 photographs and just asked if he'd superimpose to determine if they were the same person. And he created a GIF during which you can see Noah Pozner turn into Michael Wagner, which of course means that Noah Pozner is Michael Wagner as a child. He's a fiction. And I've already been talking about Adam Lanza, where we now have a new participant, by the way, in the Sandy Hook research community. This is a Newtown mother, a 3rd-generation resident of Newtown, who had her own 2 children in the 2nd grade at a different school, obviously not at Sandy Hook since it wasn't even open, but had been closed since 2008. When the event went down, who has gone through a rather long journey of discovery to come to the realization that Sandy Hook was in fact an elaborate scam. Now, she is well known in the community because she used to maintain a blog about Newtown events. And she's also, therefore, she has experience as a journalist, and she has now given me 2 blogs to publish on my website, and her name is Rebecca Carnes, Carnes. And if you go to my blog at jamesfetzer.org, I repeat, jamesfetzer.org, you'll find there are 2 blogs back to back, one of which is Rebecca going through the yearbook for the Newtown High School and finding a whole host of anomalies that substantiate the conclusion that Adam Lanza was a fiction, where his image was just made up. And she offers some suggestions where they may have been inspired to make up the fiction. The second is about smart meters and how she discovered her house had a smart meter and how she went to her electric provider and asked that it be replaced, and how they refused to even talk to her, really. And when she declared she would stay until someone gave her customer service, I mean, that's what she was there for. They called the police and had her arrested for a grossly exaggerated charge of a criminal trespass in the 1st degree. I mean, that's just ridiculous. She has got to respond to the charges. She's going to have a public defender at her assistance, and I believe it's going to be obvious from the evidence that this was overcharging and that, in fact, she had done nothing wrong, and I expect she will be exonerated. In the meanwhile, she has published a blog about smart meters that many of you may also find to be of interest. So there we have the latest contributor to Sandy Hook, a woman from Newtown herself. And of course, Connecticut was involved in this thing from the top to the bottom, from the governor, the lieutenant governor, the state police, and a host of other.
Jim, sorry, we did talk about this on the first interview, so the info is already out there, but we've only got about 8 minutes left. There is something I want to talk about. This may be the one of the most far out things that I would discuss with you, because I know that you try to stick to down-to-earth evidence that you can prove and all, but one of your books, it's great that you're doing it, and I don't deny that the info in your book is right, but what I see as a little bit of a hindrance in regards to what your book has done, and I did actually talk with you about this at the Free Your Mind conference that you were at a couple years ago, and you did laugh after I said this, but in all seriousness, it's no laughing matter. And what I'm talking about is the moon landing book. Now, yes, from a standpoint of what we had in front of us and what's in the public arena, there wasn't the technology to go to the moon, but the general consensus among all the whistleblowers out there and all the people who were compartmentalized in the whole thing was that the moon landings, yeah, they were faked and all to save money and whatnot, but the ability to go to the moon was possible and it was done. And even Project Camelot has got involved with this, with Bill Ryan, the former Project Camelot Bill Ryan, saying that he spoke to someone who said we did go to the moon, but it wasn't that simple. We were all compartmentalized. We got all sorts of technology that was shown to us that we never knew existed, and this stuff was now this guy never actually said there were actual extraterrestrials involved with this, but the idea is that when we did go to the moon, we actually used extraterrestrial technology, and that was not brought out to the public arena, so naturally you are not going to be talking about that in your book. But I still cannot help but ask, do you not see it as a bit of a hindrance that you're saying what you're saying? Because if you want to get the whole truth in the end, you have to eventually be willing to talk about the whole ET factor thing, including the far out technologies that they use. So wouldn't you maybe someday be willing to address this and say, okay, I didn't take into account the fact that there were ETs helping us, and out of the public arena there was technology that did enable us to go to the moon, or are you probably not going to go that route?
Well, remember, I said that all scientific conclusions are held in the tentative and fallible fashion of science, meaning if you acquire new evidence or alternative hypotheses, you may have to reject hypotheses you previously accepted, accept hypotheses you previously rejected, and leave others in suspense. There is so much evidence that the moon landing was fake, that we could not have gone there, that we didn't have the propulsion power, we didn't have the computing power, we could never have navigated the Van Allen radiation belt. We even have NASA spokesmen in recent years stating that the greatest obstacle to man travel to Mars is the Van Allen radiation belt, as though if it were a problem today in traveling to Mars, it wouldn't have been a problem in 1969 and 70 of traveling to the moon. There are such brilliant studies as Conspiracy. Did we go to the moon? Which is available online. In about 45 minutes, you'll get, I would say, 24 scientific proofs that we didn't go to the moon. Here's the simplest one, in my opinion. We have seen photographs allegedly of Earth taken from the moon. But stop and think about the photographs you've seen. What they actually are photographs of the moon from Earth, where the moon has been photoshopped to look like Earth. And let me give you the dispositive argument here. Earth has 55 times the mass of the moon. If you're taking a photograph of Earth from the moon, you'd see nothing but Earth. The Earth would be gigantic. It would fill the whole visual field. So we know all this is completely phony and fake. I've done a couple interviews with Scott Henderson, who's proven quite brilliant. He discovered in some of the moon landing footage, you can find the outline of a Corvette that is buried there. They were shooting some of this in a landfill. He has done more recently a study of the spacesuits, the astronaut spacesuits, which could no more have functioned as spacesuits, could the facilities and the alleged German camps have functioned as gas chambers, which is also a subject, by the way, that's addressed in the book, the Moon Book. And I suppose we didn't go to the moon either. Now in its second edition, which is my favorite of all of our books, it was actually not banned because of the studies that support we didn't go to the moon, but because of the studies that debunk the mythology known as the Holocaust, where Amazon deleted some 2,000 books at the request of the Anti-Defamation League because they dispute the official narrative of the Holocaust. The reason being that the political power or influence of Israel and Zionists generally is rooted in a Western sense of guilt over the Holocaust. So if the Holocaust is exposed as mythology, because they were actually work camps, and you can't get work out of a corpse, that they were using Zyklon B to kill body lice, so to prevent the spread of typhus and dysentery in the camps. That the floor plan of Auschwitz, for example, has all kinds of facilities that are inconsistent with it having been a center for extermination, not just a swimming pool, which has been argued was only for the guards, but there's a symphony house, there's a woodworking, there's a hospital with OBGYN facilities. Indeed, it's a stunning fact, little known, that hundreds of babies were born in these so-called death camps, hundreds of babies. Nick Kollerstrom has a brilliant book, Breaking the Spell, where he has become, I think, the foremost historian to assess the role of these camps and what was actually going on there, where he had access to the British death books. The Brits had cracked the German code, so they had access to all the German records, which were very meticulous and detailed, and they correspond very exactly to the reports of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which were keeping copious detailed records on the age, the sex, the ethnicity, the religion, the lineage of those who died, including their cause of death, which they recalibrated in 1993, the grand total being 296,081 deaths, none of which occurred from death by gas chamber. So they just wiped the slate. Now, I'm totally open to evidence that there was some kind of ET-derived technology. Andrew, you're hardly the first to raise this possibility. I simply haven't seen the proof. That's all. Science operates on the basis of observation, measurement, and experiment, as well as inference to the best explanation, which I've been outlining before in terms of those 4 steps, processes, or procedure. If I were presented with evidence that there had been a successful trip to the moon by alien technology, for example, anti-gravity craft and so forth, I would be very glad to take it into consideration and adjust my beliefs accordingly. But let me make a very simple point. Between the front and the back of the moon, the light side and the dark side of the moon, there's like a 700 degrees Celsius difference. It's like 350 degrees Celsius on the one side, which is extremely hot. It's like 350 degrees below zero Celsius on the dark side of the moon, meaning it's very difficult to see how any living thing could actually be supported on the surface of the moon. And most certainly, the spacecraft we had couldn't have made the trip. The spacesuits we had couldn't have done it. Even the space rocks that are alleged to be the best proof were actually gathered by Werner von Braun, who led an expedition to Antarctica prior to '69 to collect space moon rocks that had been dislodged from the surface of the moon by the impact with small asteroids, which had been captured by Earth's gravitational field and brought down to Earth and landed in the Antarctic, so they could be presented as bona fide moon rocks, only that hadn't reached Earth by the mode of transportation alleged. I mean, look, Andrew, I'm open to it, but I haven't seen it yet.
I just give you credit for that. That's good. That's good. And well, since we reached the 2-hour part, I want to thank you and all, and I want to give you the chance right now to get out your contact info, also the how people can donate to you, so you can get the lawsuit out to that.
Well, listen, we're in kind of a lull right now. I do not need donations right now. We're at the point where the final elements of the trial, where I was denied the right to present my case because the judge would not allow me to present any of the evidence that Sandy Hook was actually a FEMA drill. The judge did not allow me to present that evidence. Plus, the mainstream and the reports claim this was an authored book when it was an edited book. As soon as you learn it had 13 contributors, including 6 current or retired PhD professors, the very idea that we're wrong in our conclusions is ridiculous. Our conclusions have all been further substantiated by the research in 2018. The POTUS memoranda you can find on the website of Robert David Steele. So I say, when my appeal is successful and I have the right to a trial,
a jury trial,
then I will need funds. Then I will come back to you and Andrew, and I'll say, look, let's bang the drum, because this is going to be the trial of the century. This is going to blow Sandy Hook apart, because I already have very substantial witnesses. I have a mass of evidence. I've only needed the opportunity to present it, which I've heretofore been denied by the court. So I say, if you want to follow my work, there are lots of blogs about Sandy Hook and its current status at jamesfetzer.org. I have all kinds of videos at 153news.net posted by Gus Chambers. I have other videos on BitChute, many of which are posted by Brian Ruhe, R-U-H-E. The most important for this purpose is Sandy Hook update. Tracy loses, Wolfgang wins, because the lawsuit that Pozner brought against Wolfgang in Florida was dismissed after the judge directed that he had to sit for a video deposition, and withdrew his suit, which was like my suit, just as you were observing what's known as a SLAP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation intended to punish those who are exposing the truth and to set an example for others that if they follow my or Wolfgang's example, this is what will happen to them. It's all shocking, but you put your finger right on it. So you can find a lot about that there too. Look for that one, Sandy Hook update. Tracy loses, Wolfgang wins, the deep state strikes back. If you just look for Sandy update, you'll find it at 153news.net or at BitChute, because YouTube takes down my videos now. It's a massive suppression effort, censorship. So between my blog and the videos, and I'm on Twitter at Jim Fetzer. I'm on Twitter at Jim Fetzer. And Andrew, I want to thank you for having me on. It was a great pleasure, and I look forward to returning on a future occasion.
Yes, and if there's an update with the case, I will definitely give you the opportunity to come out and spill the beans on that as well, and maybe some other conspiracy theory stuff. That I don't talk about conspiracy as much as I used to back in the day, but hey, some of this truth does have to get out to the people who still aren't awake.
Let me close by observing conspiracies are as American as apple pie.
Exactly. Right. All right. Take care, Jim, and good luck on everything that you do. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks so much.